And video POIs if possible, if not, audio works.
Oh, sorry, my internet got bad. I'm Tanya. I'm gonna be the first speaker. Shifa, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Team Romania, who will be giving the reply speech?
I will.
Okay, perfect. If Op could also please do the same.
Hi, my name is Dylan. I'll be the first speaker for opposition, and my pronouns are he, him.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline, and I'll be doing the second and reply speech for opposition, and also we prefer verbal POIs. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Edward. I'll be giving the whip for the op. Good luck, everyone.
Again, thank you all for your introductions. Welcome to round 3 of ARGO Open 2021. I wish you the best of luck going forward. Just to be clear on timing rules, this is WSTC, hence it's 8-minute speeches. Your first and your last minute are protected. Also a reminder that reply speeches are 4 minutes, all under protected time. I'll be timing, but I also advise speakers to time themselves. So don't necessarily lose track of time if they're not looking at the chat while the keying in the timestamps. Without further ado, I'll now invite the first proposition speaker. Here.
Excellent. Am I audible? Is it okay?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Just 1 second to set my timer and papers. Panel, you cannot have a proper functioning democracy if you turn it into a playground for the rich to deploy their weapons, which is money, to. You cannot have a representative society if people aren't truly represented, because it's not about the votes, it is about the money you put in before that. On that grounds, so proud to propose this motion. What I'm going to do in this speech is have 3 main areas. Firstly, we're going to discuss some setup. How does this happen and how will it work? Then I'm going to bring you 2 arguments. The first one about how you better empower democracy on our side of the house, and the second one about reshaping the way we think about campaigns. So now let us get into the elements of setup. Note, panel, that currently the way elections happens is mainly through donations from different types of funders, whether they are privates, which is either companies that give severe amount of funds to certain parties that represent their interests, or it's rich people that just genuinely bring money out of their own pockets in order to fund themselves, for example, like Donald Trump did, or whether these donations are public ones, like grassroots campaigns in which politicians gain money from the people. We say all of these extraneous donations should be cut out from the election process. Note, panel, second clarification is that any party that registers and has received a certain minimum number of required signatures in order to have a place on the election ballots is going to receive the same amount of money from a publicly owned state governmental institution. Then thirdly, note, panel, that these people cannot possibly use private money or any sort of money for anything else. They have to declare what they do and where they get the funds from. And in as much no thank you as those funds don't come from the public source, from the government, we say they can be punished for that. And lastly, panel, we're talking about all elections inside a country, whether they're at a local level, at a regional level, or evidently at a national level. So now I'm going to enter my first argument about how this is the way to empower democracy. No, thank you. I'll take it later. But before that, panel, let's understand, why do we care so much about democracy generally in states? We tell you because of 2 reasons. First of all, it ensures representativity, because in a system that is as oppressive as the state, no thank you, as oppressive as a state that takes so many decisions for you that you can't possibly escape, where you have your autonomy constantly guarded by the laws other people set, the only counterweight you can actually have to that is receiving a capacity to have people that genuinely represent you. The second reason we care about democracy is because it ensures It ensures plurality. It gives you a choice. It gives you a plethora of people to choose from so that you can weigh whichever of them represents your interest the best. It doesn't just give you one or two options that probably don't represent you. It gives you many. We think the team that is able to uphold these two principles best in this debate and best ensures the quality of democracy thus wins this debate today. But now, panel, let us discuss how are these things, no thank you, actually ensured. We tell you that these two principles are ensured in two main instances. First of all, where people have equal access to accessing these benefits, right? Politicians and people that generally want to represent others don't have extraneous barriers to entering the political system. And secondly, when rich people can't circumvent the general usual paths in democracy. Now, panel, why is money in campaigns an exact circumvention of the representativity of democracy? Let us talk about the power of money and what it actually does there. We say, first of all, it gives you the capacity to attract a lot of people to build your campaign from the get-go. It gives you a capacity to out-hire anyone else around you because you have so many funds to deploy in staff working for you within the campaign. Of course, that gives you an advantage because your campaign is much larger and much better crafted than others. Second reason, it gives you a capacity to hire expertise on the way you conduct your campaign. It gives you the capacity to hire analysts that can look at the way your campaign is being crafted and look at polls and see how you can be more smart about it. But it also gives you a capacity to do more rallies and organizing where you have the capacity to have more people watch you. And lastly, panel, it gives you branding and it gives you marketing. And I think, honestly, that's the thing that companies should do, no thank you, not least politicians and democracies. What all of these things do is that they make the rich get unfairly ahead out of everyone who cannot possibly afford all of those things, right? And why is this so harmful uniquely? We say on one hand, because it makes people vote against their own interests, right? Because they simply don't know and don't get to see the people that would have actually represented their interests because those people cannot possibly get ahead in front of the rich ones that genuinely get to craft well-attentive images of themselves. But secondly, panel, it blocks minority parties or any type of parties from actually entering the race. Because at the point at which they even try to get into it, they're overpowered by far larger structures and far richer people that can actually push them out immediately. Because if no thank you, I'll take you in a second, if 4 in 5 ads that you see go and tell you to vote for Donald Trump, I assure you, you're not going to see any other Republican or any other party rather than him. This all means that all of these harms ensure that the representativity and plurality of politics is not sustained. Before entering my second argument, I'll be glad to take a point.
Would you allow individuals to privately campaign or buy ads for a certain candidate?
Okay, so first of all, I don't think this is extremely relevant in this situation. I think largely most of these individuals do actually go into politics in the name of a rally, in the name of a party. That's what happens in the most majority of situations. But then also, if they meet the extent of signatures and they basically qualify as the equivalent of a party, then probably they could enter the race and of course access the same public funds. The claim is simple, just no extra money, wherever they might come from, wherever you get them from, we just don't want the extra money in. So now let's talk about how we can reshape the way we think about campaigns. Because panel note that currently campaigns are drafted exactly on this cult of money that is a prerequisite to how we look at the people we vote for. They are drafted on a cult of personality that is built through the marketing and through the insanely mediatized people that these campaigns sell. It is much more about the way you sell yourself because you have the money to, rather than what you actually say. And panel, the mechanism is extremely clear here. In as much as you have less funds and less capacity to skew off the system by doing illegitimate stuff, you're going to have to rethink the way you go. And the most cost benefit and most opportunist way to do this is you're going to have to find other ways in which to convince people to actually look at you. whether that's going to be by the way you debate the people around you, right? By the way you craft your answers and you attract people, by the power of your words and the power of your thoughts, whether that's going to be through the policy you can propose. Because now money can no longer be a differentiating factor. So it's going to have to be the empirical evidence that you bring for what you do. It's going to be the arguments that you bring for what you do. It's going to be the things you say, not much the polished photoshopped image that your campaign can craft for you. And we see, panel notes, that most of this analysis doesn't just apply in countries like the US, where you just have two parties. Look all across Europe, where you constantly have coalitions of 3 to 4 parties in power. Those are exactly the places where these differentiating factors can literally pull out new parties with different ideologies at every second. What all of this means ultimately is that in as much as the campaigning process is bettered, people genuinely get to see more of the people that they're actively voting for, because they're no longer overshadowed by the branding that's behind them. The democratic process is thus increased as an effect of it. For all of these reasons, so proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
I think that speak of that fine speech, and we now invite the first opposition speaker. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Proposition at the very get-go has already missed half of this debate, because it's not just about politicians. They also talk about how voters and individual people who choose to donate are actually effective. They should probably build on that in their second speech if they want any chance in weighing against this debate. With that said, before moving on to our substantive, 3 points of response. One, they say the barrier to run right now is too high. It's very difficult for individuals to run. I think this is a double-edged sword, and they need to acknowledge this, right? Because for every individual who might have good ideas who's trying to run, you have another 10 people who have very bad ideas, but now get equal funding to far larger, far more dominant ideas, getting the exact same amount of resources running in the public sphere, taking up public resources and influencing the public's mind. They need to engage that, because I think a political system where 90% of parties are quite meaningless or unrepresentative probably isn't the best. Secondly, there's still ways for smaller individuals who aren't very rich to get noticed in the status quo, right? Things like crowdfunding are becoming more and more popular. Things like social media becoming more and more popular, as well as facts like, for example, the way most politicians no longer need very, very rich donors to make money, right? For example, Bernie Sanders' average donation was $20. You don't really need huge billionaires and millionaires behind you just to run down the status quo. Neither do you have to be a millionaire or billionaire to run. I think, for example, AOC was able to become very, very relevant and very popular without being very rich when she was born. So that's already a way you're able to run in the status quo that's likely to improve in the future. But thirdly, it's also important for prompt to debate, as I mentioned, on how voters are affected, right? Because this debate is also about how their money that goes into the government is allocated, how their own political beliefs are being influenced, and the way their individual votes are actually getting casted. Now, with that said, what's ARGO going to look like? One, you can still have private donations, so individuals can donate upon a certain limit to individual politicians. We're still able to have that. And secondly, I would argue larger parties obviously would probably get more money, and by doing so probably better represent the public. And three, I would also on our side, we have comparatively less major parties that are being considered during the vote. So instead, on their side, you might have maybe 100 parties running, 10 parties running at best. On our side, we probably have 2 or 3 or 4 dominant parties. With that said, 2 arguments. One, on why it's principally unjust to ban people from donating, and secondly, on why why allocation shouldn't be equal to all parties, because of a couple of reasons I'll talk about. Firstly, on the principle, 2 things to look at here. 1, on the freedom of expression, and 2, on coercion. Firstly, on the freedom of expression, a major part of the democratic process is the right to spend your money how you want and to support the political party that actually represents you. Because in this case, it is a very crucial form of your own political representation to spend your own money in a way that gets you what you actually want in your life, right? So me choosing to spend $10 that I actually earned onto a party, and by doing so, getting my own beliefs represented to a further degree and benefiting that party and getting what I want represented is a very crucial part of this democratic process. This is where our POR is actually relevant, where they basically just said, didn't really give a proper answer, right? Because on their side of the house, what they're essentially doing is restricting the individual's right to advocate for what they actually believe in. On our side, I would argue you can do, for example, have an advertisement where you spend your own money in promoting a political party. It is a question they need to answer on the proposition whether or not they would support that. I'll wait for them to respond in the second speech. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Everyone has the capacity to support their parties. Everyone gets 1 vote, but some people have more money than others. Why should they have more capacity to support their own parties rather than people who don't have the money to do so? Why shouldn't it be equal for everyone?
Yeah, like what I just talked about, right? Like you have the right to actually spend your money in the ways that you represent. Like, for example, the POI that we did give you, like, would you allow an average individual to spend that money on, for example, a campaign ad on his own individual basis with his own money? That's a question you need to answer. But secondly, I would argue it's no longer the fact that you have to be a millionaire just to have political representation. Like Bernie Sanders was able to get money from a lot of smaller donors, and by doing so, they're also able to use their money in a very positive manner. I would argue that's a lot better. But thirdly, on our side, on your side, if you still allow individuals to advocate, by not donating to the government, but on an individual basis, like, advertise, I would argue that's still a lot worse on your side of the house. Secondly, on why you're coerced to support other parties on their side of the house, right? Because I would argue that when you spend your tax dollars which are in this public fund on their side of the house, you essentially coerce individuals to support parties and beliefs they don't directly agree with or in direct opposition to. For example, on their side, if this money isn't a public fund, which is consisted of the individual's tax dollars, that is then spent on supporting parties that you might drastically not agree with, right? Very extreme parties with very extreme beliefs that you don't believe with are now getting your money to spend in a way where they're able to get more power and not represent you. I would argue it's extremely problematic in a democratic system. What's the difference between that and spending money in a regular government, right? I would argue regular government policies, one, often are democratic in that you did democratically elect a leader, and that's part of the democratic process, which means, for example, Medicare for all is voted for. But secondly, it's also used to actually benefit the individual, right? Spending money on a healthcare plan is able to benefit people within the country and represents the majority. But spending money on an individual party is not that, right? You only represent a very small group of people, and in many cases, very good that it doesn't actually include you. In those situations, I would argue your money should not be spent in those manners. Secondly, why resource allocation shouldn't be equal to all parties. 3 points to look at here. One, money is wasted. I think in most political systems, there are certain small parties that often wouldn't ever be able to get significant amounts of voters, regardless of how much money they get. For example, the Green Party in the US is very unlikely to take power because it's just very unlikely, if 50% of individuals see trees is so important as they will vote on that as their sole voting issue, right? So in those situations, I would argue money is wasted because in those situations, your tax dollars can go towards bigger parties that often represent more people and therefore probably be meaningful for them to have further debate and further resources to compete with each other, not go to other smaller parties that have far less representation on far less meaning. What's the impact here? Firstly, on accessibility, right? One, I would argue in most cases, large parties are able to increase access when they have more spending. For example, go to smaller towns and advocate to them instead of only advocating very dense areas because now you have far more funding on that comparative. Secondly, I would argue in terms of those smaller individual parties, it's also just a waste of resources because you crowd out the other forms of engagement, right? So if 90% of advertisement you see is irrelevant to you and you're never going to actually believe it, I would argue it probably isn't a good thing for that percentage of your political representation and engagement to be wasted in that sense. But thirdly, I would also misallocation just principally wrong on the very first basis, right? Because the way the government should allocate your money should be representative to you and should benefit the people the most. So the money could be spent on 100 different things, but now it's being publicly allocated to very irrelevant parties that are never going to actually take charge. That is a waste of tax dollars going to be otherwise spent on far better places. Secondly, and this is very important, when you fragment parties, I'm not going to take any more POIs. Why is this extremely problematic? Because at the point when you give party funding exactly equally to individual parties, the only boundary that's set on the proposition is apparently, a couple of signatures, which probably isn't a very high boundary if their entire impact is accessibility. I would argue you get far more fragmented, smaller parties. Because, for example, now the Democratic Party in the US will now fragment to maybe 10 smaller parties that are on a spectrum of how extreme you are, how not extreme you are, etc. So, for example, Bernie Sanders and now Joe Biden probably will be in drastically different parties. Why is that extremely bad, right? Because one, you give an incentive and an ability for individuals to split off whenever there's a disagreement, right? So you lose the point of discourse and the ability to be within a larger party to actually discuss and have legitimate policies. But secondly, whichever party wins, it's extremely unrepresentative. Because, for example, let's just say the largest party gets 10% of the votes. In that situation, you're only representing 10% of the population, but you're being voted as the leader of the entire country. In those cases, you get extreme policies and unrepresented policies. Even if there are other ways of, for example, maybe take the top 3 and voting within them, I would argue always in the comparative, it is far worse than a system where you have larger parties that are able to actually cooperate within themselves and have more representative policies. Therefore, I would argue a fragmented system often is inefficient and isn't able to represent as many people as we can on the opposition. Thirdly, why you strengthen fringe parties. Because no, on their side of the house, individual extremist parties in many countries that do exist get exactly as much money as mainstream parties. This is extremely bad, right? Because you give them far more resources to be far more accessible. Because right in the status quo, these individual parties often don't get a lot of votes, don't get a lot of donation money because it's a very small group of very extreme individuals to support them. But I would argue in a system where you give them far more funding money, where they're able to access more resources and advocate for their party, these extremist ideas do get proliferated to a further degree, which means more people are likely to side with the extremists and follow extremist policies. This is a net harm because we often believe these parties probably shouldn't be advocated for, especially not as much as other larger parties with better ideas, because it's a crowd out effect, right? I think a political system should represent the most meaningful ideas that do represent the most people, and we only get that when the larger parties that actually do represent and have legitimate policies get more airtime than other individual parties. I think it's far worse in a system when very extreme parties get exactly as much resources as the most mainstream parties, for example, the Democratic Party and the Republican Republican Party. For a better political system that is more representative, vote for the opposition. Thank you.
We think that speaker for that fine speech, and at this point, we now invite the second proposition speaker. Here.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. Do you think I could go very fast to the toilet?
No problem.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry again.
No problem.
Okay, then I'll go as well.
Thank you very much. And sorry.
Checking if I'm still audible.
Okay. I think we can now proceed. So we now invite the second proposition speaker. Here.
All right, then. Money and democracy are incompatible because democracy tells you that you have equal rights and you are just the same as the person next to you. That's why you have an equal vote. But money is fundamentally different because it tells you that some people in society have more votes than you because they can express themselves through the money that they have. This is the principle that Team China is defending today. And we believe that this is completely incompatible with a democratic system. Because when you have more money and they agree that this can influence the outcome of votes, that is the moment the entire democratic process is destroyed by allowing big money into this. So that means that most of the argumentation from the opposition talking about how you have freedom of expression through money should not be taken into consideration because it is against our fundamental principle of democracy. But I'll get into that later. Let's firstly clarify the model because it seems like they didn't understand it properly. They talked about how you're going to have 10 people with bad ideas for every person with a good one, but they don't understand the fundamental thing. These people are already people that have enough signatures in order to become a legitimate party or legitimate candidate. It means that people want them to be there. Even if you might not agree with their ideas, people want them to be in office. They actually believe in them. That's why they should be an option for everybody to vote for. Now, that takes a lot of the rebuttal down, but moreover than that, like the only example of grassroots movements that they have provided is Bernie Sanders, which is ironically still a millionaire and is the only guy that they could come up with because everyone else needs a lot of money from their other millionaire and billionaire friends. Like, let's just take examples of Bloomberg, which won so many elections in New York City just because he was the richest person in there. That is the reason we believe that this system is so skewed. Okay, now I'm going to have a few points of rebuttal in which I'll deal with most of the case of team opposition. Then I'll extend my case and I'll have my own argument regarding how we avoid external interferences. Quick points of rebuttal. Regarding the freedom of expression, we don't believe that you should be able to express yourself through money, because the moment you express yourself through money in a democratic process, it stops being democratic because it means a millionaire's freedom of expression counts a lot more than my freedom of expression, which is against the democratic principles that we stand. That's why we don't care about this specific type of freedom of expression. You can still go to rallies, you can still go and post on Facebook about how much you like a specific candidate, because that is your freedom of expression expressed to something that is actually valuable and equal, something democratic, unlike money. This deals with their entire point of freedom of expression. Now, the second point about coercion doesn't actually stand either, because if you actually look at the democratic process, we don't only do things that everyone agrees with. For example, we use a lot of funds in order to help minorities that might be in need. That doesn't help the majority of the population, but we still use that money because we believe it will lead to a better outcome in the future. That also justifies us using said money in order to facilitate a more democratic process in which we increase representativity. That's why their point on coercion doesn't stand. Before I move on, sure.
Freedom of speech is never equal. When a celebrity retweets something, it always gets more hits and more views than the average person. Isn't this the same thing as millionaires having more money?
No, it's not. Because even as a plain person, I can express my views and they can go viral on TikTok or something. But I can't ever overcome the barrier of money, which is fundamentally different. Like, I don't think you understand what it means to have 100,000 followers more, or what it means to have $4 billion more than the other person. That's why money is so much more important, because you get access to a lot better things. Moreover than that, we believe that that a lot of the argumentation of Team China actually plays into what we want to say. Their entire point about fragmentation and green parties essentially tells you that small parties can never get to small towns, which means that the small towns never get the option to vote for those parties, even if they would be representative for them, because they don't have the money. They essentially tell us with their own words that these parties don't have access to large chunks of the population because they don't have the money to get there. That's the exact reason why we need to give them equal amount of funds in order for them to be able to access, and then you leave it up to the people to decide whether or not they deserve the votes or not. Now that I dealt with most of the case of Team China, let's talk about what we explained in our stance. Because we talked about how money in politics is unjustified. First of all, because it creates all of the unfair advantages that Elena talked about, but moreover, you can crowd out any competition that you might have. What does this look like? It looks like the Libertarian Party that, if you look at it from a purely ideological standpoint, represents most Republicans better than the Republican Party, because most Republicans are pro small companies because they want to start their own business. They don't want to keep having tax cut after tax cut for the big corporations, which is exactly what the Republican Party has been doing for years and what the Libertarian Party has been criticizing. But do you know why the Libertarian Party doesn't have a lot of votes? Because people don't know it exists. Their rallies consist of 100 people because that's all the people they could bring with the advertisement that they have. That is the moment the entire democratic process becomes unrepresentative. What happens then? That's the exact moment when parties that might be extremist get to power, because people feel unrepresented for long enough and then they need a change. And the people that go and say that they're outside the system and that they're going to change the system from the very bedrock, that's the people that win. This is a comparative clash with the point on team opposition about how bad parties get a lot of money. It doesn't matter. It's important whether they get to power or not. And it's a lot more likely that they get to power when people have been feeling underrepresented for years and years because they live in a system that values money more than it values the rights of its own citizens. Now, let me get into my own argument about how you avoid external interferences, because we have to understand what are the incentives of a politician. Most likely, they want to get reelected. It means a lot for them to be in office for more years. One, it means a lot of reputation. Secondly, it means some money. But thirdly, it means a lot of other job prospects or a lot of power in the future. That's why their main purpose is to be reelected. So this is why in the status quo, they accept lobbying, because the power of money is so high that they know they can just take money from corporations. They can vote against the interest of the public and still win the election, because it doesn't matter if people understand that they are lobbied and that they are not representing its interest, because they look like the only candidate that they can vote for, specifically because they have so much money that they're the only candidate that ever appears on TV or on your Facebook feed. That's why they can take the trade-off. I'm going to take this money, I'm going to vote against the interest of the population, but I'm going to get those votes back with the money that I get from lobbying. Now that money from lobbying doesn't exist anymore because we only allow public money to exist, they have no trade-off anymore. That means they can only differentiate themselves and can only be re-elected the moment that they use their vote and their political capital in order to help the population. Why is this so important? Because oil companies have been lobbying for no CO2 regulations for years, and even now it's hard to pass regulations for green movements. That's why it's important for us to be able to move in a better direction where people are actually represented. And the only way you can do that is by getting money out of politics.
We think that speak of that fine speech, and we now invite the second opposition speaker. Here.
Hi, can you see and hear me like this?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Ariana Grande has 227 million followers on Instagram, and I have 200. There are millions and millions in a difference. Yes, it's unequal. I'm happy for you to try to close that gap of influence by funding some Asian empowerment movements to go on a campaign and go on to get an interview from the New York Times so I can be heard. But the proposition team today proposes we do the most counterintuitive thing to close this gap of difference. They say, let's just silence everyone then. Nobody gets to use their influence. Nobody gets to speak politically with their money and vote with their purses. No one gets to make a political statement. Because in that world, no party is represented and no one is speaking on any issues, which is when people are not informed, people don't vote on their behalf, and when politics falls apart like that. It is not fair for them to say we should just silence everyone, and that's never the way to go in a democratic debate. That is why we're proud to oppose. There are three questions I want to answer in this speech. Firstly, why we bolster minority parties. Second of all, on the principles. And lastly, why we create a fairer political system. Firstly, I want to address everything on minority parties, because no judge, this is their only grounds. The only problems they ever try to solve is about who helps prop up minority parties. And if we take this out, they have zero unique solvency in this debate. Now, what they say is money equals votes. Let's restore fairness by giving everyone the equal amount of money. But they can't just restore fairness because politics is way more nuanced than they characterize it to be. One, it's based on connections. The fact that Rudy Giuliani is loyal to big Republican parties because big Republican parties have been around for a long time and they know people and they have human resources who are willing to help them. Two, about media spotlight. When I'm an entrenched party and I know the New York Times and I can go and get interviews whenever I want versus an individual grassroots party don't have the same thing. Three, lobbying, because it's very counterintuitive that the rich people will just stop trying to influence politics when they characterize that to be the biggest goal of rich corporations and rich billionaires. They will just talk behind closed doors, make secret deals like let's set up a trust or foundation where I can slip you money without you knowing, or just say I will threaten to never let you onto CNN or Washington Post, which I own, and you will never get another segment unless you do what I ask. They will still leverage every ounce of their money and every ounce of their connections and energy to try to influence politics. So what's the only difference in this debate if they cannot restore fairness given all these other factors that influence politics? The difference is when I donate as a super PAC or donate as a corporation, it is by tax laws that I have to declare this and give it to the public for scrutiny, for the FEC to check if I abide by the regulations with all of these like donations that I'm making. Versus if it's lobbying behind closed doors or such threats or using their connections and coercing to doing something, none of this is transparent. We can't call candidates out on the force of debate. We can't go and dig into their influences and try to campaign against them. We can't call them out in the public because everything is not transparent. So rich people will still try to talk, will still try to influence politics, but it's not traceable on their side and we can never call them out on their side. Now, can minority parties enter politics on our side? Yes, every single big party today started as a small party and accumulated more and more support if they're doing a good job. AOC, the incumbent they want to talk about in New York that keeps on running on the same money, AOC beat him with taking zero super PAC money with only crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. This shows you how if you have good policies and you rally the people and you listen to your demographics, you can enter into politics, especially in the age of social media. The Black Lives Matter movement or #MeToo only use social media as the way, and they still gain so much momentum. These big politicians who went to Ivy League schools have no excuses to say, if I don't have equal funding, I can't make a way for myself. So who are these minority parties who are failing on their side? They're the single issue parties, right? The Lib Dems who don't have a engaged full-on platform in Britain, and they only care about the issue of Brexit. They only want to tackle one issue, which is why they don't speak to the people. Yes, they have a right to enter the ballot as long as they have a certain amount of signatures, but they do not have a right to say, as long as I have the baseline amount of signatures, I deserve equal levels of economic prosperity, and equal levels of popular success, and equal levels of this engagement from the public if I'm only able to engage in one certain issue instead of covering everything that people want to hear about. So yes, they have a right to be on the ballot. That exists on our side too, with these small parties rising, but they cannot say their principal right extends to them having the same amount of money and same amount of resources to leverage as any other party when these minority parties are like this for a reason. Moving on to the second question about principles, and here's where they do not engage our argumentation, and there are three prongs in which we already win. Firstly, money equals political expression, and you can't force people to express their political views in a particular way by forcefully assigning their money. Now they say everyone should only have one vote, equal political voice. So because there's different money, therefore you shouldn't be able to express all of this. That means celebrities shouldn't be able to talk about politics, even if it's just one-on-one with people, because they're influential and they have this authority. That means that if we have different degrees of social media followers, we should ban political discourse from social media, because again, it is unequal. Nothing is ever equal in this world, in the reality of everything we need to encounter. But the way we restore fairness is to say you can express whatever you want with everything you have. Every single ounce of wealth that you have accumulated, you should use to support the candidate and back the candidate you support. You should be able to go out there every single day and tell people who you want to vote for. These are the things this is a freedom we grant to people to restore that fairness and to have you give you political expression over everything you have control over, not take away avenues of political expression and fake that to be fairness. But secondly, we think the incumbent administration, which is what's happening in this debate, where the incumbent administration is making a policy about how the next election should happen and whose voices we favor in the next election, just can't happen because you're principally and politically motivated to do a particular thing. You're tainted by your biases. And in this case, when they said the election committee to say who's on the ballot, who's going to be able to receive this funding and who's not going to be able to, when they shape this policy and pass this policy, it's opening up to millions of loopholes where they get to shape politics for the next 8 years or 12 years or even more. That is when the incumbent administration should just not be involved. No one should dictate where funding is allocated, how funding is allocated. That's something up to the voters to directly transact with the parties. That's the only way to restore fairness. Lastly, I want to say government money isn't just money. It's a form of endorsement and legitimization because it's taxpayer money that's validated by the fact that it's the US government, such an entrenched government and administration and place. When you're spending it on anything, you're legitimizing them. This is why it is crucial when they don't say that they're going to exclude fringe parties as long as they have enough signatures to get on the ballot. Because the British National Front, who is so bigoted and xenophobic and just blatantly discriminatory, will still get this funding. And this funding is no longer just money coming from individual donors. It is a stamp of approval from the British government. The Italian five-star movement will get a stamp of approval of legitimization from the Italian government as well, not just individual bigots who are willing to give them money. This is horrible because the fringe parties that we're trying to fight against, who are bigoted, who are the populist, will be legitimized on their side of the house and appear to be more credible on their side. Sure, I'll take a POI.
Look, you're acting as if the government endorses one party or give funds to one party. They're giving funds to everyone that's willing and has enough signature. Why is that discrimination?
That doesn't mean that when it's U.S. taxpayer money coming from the U.S. Treasury, it's not carrying the weight of the U.S. government's trustworthiness and it's a stamp of approval. Yes, it's going to Democrats, but it's still also legitimizing the five-star movement, which cracks down on minorities every single day. And you need to tell me why that is correct. Moving on to the last question about a fair political system. The only analysis here they have is more choice is good. More choice means you have more freedom. On the outside, yes, on the ballot, there are more parties. That doesn't mean you have more choice because on their side, it's more likely that a minority president gets elected because whichever side is less splintered or has less sub-parties will win the election even if I only have 12% of the vote because the other side just has more smaller parties. Even if the liberals have more votes, conservatives can easily win because the liberals are so splintered in this case. So yes, apparently there's more choice, but that doesn't mean there's more representation and more meaningful votes are being counted when minorities can easily win on their side. I want to talk about this stakeholder and how we help them too. One, because I think on their side, there's less money as a whole. When people think that the money, you can't control where it goes or which party it goes to, and therefore are less likely to donate or be willing to give up their money, that means there's a lack of money in general in the overall pie for political parties to run activities in. And if that means less rallies, less campaigns, then the poorest of the poor who are being undereducated and underrepresented won't be meaningfully informed about the platforms of every single party to cast the best vote for themselves. But two, bigger parties are just better for minorities because that's when the climate refugees, women, African Americans, and Asians can come together and say, let's work on each other's issue. I provide you the votes for one and you provide me the votes for the other because I'm a big party and we can work together to tackle all these minority issues versus a bunch of small parties who are standing for these individual demographics will be easily ignored in every single election because they're not pulling their resources together and forming this big party that can speak for themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, it's ridiculous to think that the rich will stop speaking on their side. They'll speak more quietly, more subtly, and in a more untraceable manner. We're so proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech, and we now welcome the third proposition speaker. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
1 second to set my timer. is at the moment at which some parties have the self-sustaining ability to prolong their monopoly over the people, over the votes of the people, and some fail and even get back, even disappear because they do not have the same ability, because they cannot appear in the public sphere because of the monopoly entrenched by the bigger parties. That representativity is not achieved, and the qualities of democracy are not achieved in our world. I'm going to have two clashes in my debate. First of all, about representativity and where do we better uphold democracy, and secondly, on where do we have better campaigns. But before that, I want to make a clear clarification, because this debate is not only about the United States of America or about countries where we have two-party system. This debate is about the entire world, countries like Germany, Italy, Romania as well, where you have multi-party system and you have 4 or 5, even more parties, from which some of them are entrenched on the people's votes. They have capacity to fund their campaigns, and the rest of them are not as rich. The minority parties are not as rich as the rest of them. Now, with this in mind, entering my first point about representativity and where do we better uphold democracy. What I have told you basically in this debate is, from our first speaker throughout our last now, is that some people circumvent democracy because of the money they have. There are more parties in the political system, as I've told you, but some are established. They have a monopoly on people's votes. Like in our country, in Romania, we have two parties. We have the SPD, the Democratic Party, and we have the Liberal Party, who have been the only parties from 6 parties have been voted throughout years and years. And they're not necessarily the best parties who represent the people's vote. They are extremely corrupt. And the parties who are smaller, they simply do not have the ability to gain attention, even though they have better policies. More about that later. Already I have told you, what the opposition has basically told us in this debate is that it's good to have only 2 parties, because the rest of them, the minority parties, are not worth investing into. We think this is extremely problematic. It is an extremely problematic stance for them to take in this debate, because we need to uphold the principle of representativity. We need to give all the people in our countries the right to be represented, and not all the people in our country fit their views into the views of those 2 parties who have monopoly over people's vote, because they tend to attract the most attention because of the money they have to invest in public, in funding their campaigns, the things like flyers, marches, and so on. And what do we basically do through this motion? We equalize the playing field between these parties. We give a voice to also the smaller parties which exist in our country. And why is that specifically very good to give a voice to more parties? More benefits. First of all, because you get a much larger spectrum of ideas, as my colleagues have told you. You get representativity for more people than just the ones who fit in the mainstream parties. For example, you also get the parties, if all of parties receive the same amount of funding, and not only the rich ones are able to circumvent the system, then maybe the Green Party has the same ability to market itself and get into parliament so as to propose policies for climate change. Or maybe a minority rights party gets the same ability to be represented in the parliament, and not only the established parties who do not take into account the rights and the beliefs of these people. Second of all, these established parties also have a complacency because of captive voter base, because they know they are rich, because they know their monopoly can prolong for years and for years. They are not interested to do things for their voter bases, because they know that their voter bases are going to vote for them anyway, because they have money to put flyers on every street. And what does this create? These parties do not propose legislation which is actually beneficial for the people. The campaigns that they do, as we've told you, no thank you, the campaigns they do, as we told you, are much rather a battle of advertising rather than a battle of policy. Third of all, we're telling you that Third of all, about what we have heard in this debate about extremist parties. We have told you very beautifully the response to extremist parties and what you say that they do not deserve to receive these types of funding. First of all, we think that representativity should be achieved in most circumstances. We should give these parties a platform to say their views, and then for people to be able to assess them and then realize that these parties are not worth it. We think that the other parties need to have the ability to debate with them, to counter, to rebuttal them, rather than this party being silenced and them even more angry. But even so, we have told you that it is that these parties are voted when people feel unrepresented, where there are only two parties who have monopoly on people's votes, like it's happening right now in Romania, like it's happening in Germany, and so on, like it's happened with Trump and with Nigel Farage in Brexit.
Point.
And also, one second. Also, with Trump, you cannot avoid populist leaders if you allow their own personal funds. Like it happened with Trump. We often have populist leaders who have very big funds for themselves and who can platform specifically because they have a lot of money. Please, your point.
On your side with more parties, even if more people vote liberally, as long as the liberal side is more splintered with more sub-parties, conservative candidates can easily win. So can you explain to me why more options on a ballot equals representation?
Okay, understand. Usually, political systems do not work like they happen in the United States. They're not one party who is very splintered. We have the more progressive Democrats and we have the more centrist Democrats. Usually parties have a united vision. It happens in parties who have multi-party systems. So in these parties, there won't be a problem. Multi-party systems also have coalitions between each other and between each other. So this certainly won't be a problem. Your argument only applies to the United States and maybe UK. And even in those cases, we would allocate the same amount of funds, for example, to each politician, and every one of them will have the same ability to platform their own policies, whether or not these are centrist or more progressive. And lastly, in this clash, very importantly, their only alternative to this inequality created in a society is Bernie Sanders being able to grassroots his way into to make grassroots campaigns and to gain funds. What about all the parties, all the minority parties all throughout Europe, all throughout South America, all throughout Southeastern Asia? What about the parties who support green policies, who fall because they are not voted and we do not get them into the parliament? We do not get representation while our planet is burning, and only the liberals and for example, two parties who have monopoly in our country are voted and continue to have vote. And lastly, in this clash, it's very absurd to compare Twitter followers with political system, because in political systems, the distinction is that we have the lives of millions of people are at stake. The policies that these politicians pass affects the livelihoods of millions of people, whether or not we received rights for education or rights to hospitalization and so on. Now, moving on into my second clash, which is a shorter one, but very importantly, where do we have better campaigns? A second argument which has gone unrebutted all throughout this debate, and we think is very important. Politicians will concentrate more on other things. Right now, political campaigns are rather a battle of who has the best advertising campaigns. What we will get out of it, we will get competition. The older parties will have less money, the same amount of funds, so they will need to concentrate on things that attract voter bases, on things that actually matter, like policies, like debates between each other. So we will get competitions. These parties will actually get to propose the ideas that they want for their citizens, things which did not happen in our current political system because of monopolies and because of being able to prolong their monopoly. And lastly, and very importantly here, what we have heard are split argument about lobbying, how bad it is that pharma companies and oil companies are able to abuse things, to be abusive and to get away with abuse just because they lobby and give money to politicians. And what team opposition basically tells us is that it will happen on our side of the house as well. Well, there are much less likelihoods when you punish them and you send them to jail to happen compared to a world in which we freely allow them to pollute our planet and we freely allow them to do evergreening policies. For all these reasons, because we want to equalize the playing field and give a voice to everyone, I'm so proud to propose.
We can get speaker for that fine speech, and we now invite the third opposition speaker. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear and see me?
Yes, you're visible and audible.
Great. Proposition's model, in order to have fairness for all, is to bring everybody down. Through 24 minutes of their speech, they have never told us once as to why they actually have solvency to the fact that the establishment has always rigged politics from the very beginning. It is unclear to us as to why this singular policy will fix that from the get-go. Two clashes to summarize this debate. Firstly, in terms of donations as expression, and secondly, in terms of who gets better representative politics. Firstly, donations as expression. understand that freedom of speech isn't equal ever. That when you make political statements because of the relative powers and because of the relative influence of individuals, it is impossible to have it so that everybody's voice is equally heard. And they say that the difference is much bigger when you have money, but it doesn't play into that. It's the fact that political analysts and journalists, for example, have much more of a sway than your average protester or your person on the street yelling from a soapbox. This necessarily does mean that it's impossible to have a society in which everybody can be equally heard. The oversaturation in and of itself makes it logistically impossible. But the point is to say that every single person gives all they can, and because of that, there is an equal opportunity of freedom of expression. That is how freedoms work in the status quo. What we would say then is that if there is an inequity, you follow what opposition does, which is to empower the mechanisms to make that freedom of expression stronger for those on the very bottom. It looked like unions, for example, collectivizing and having a collective show of support for certain candidates that they feel support them. It looks like the fact that politicians in the status quo go to visit small towns, to talk to individuals on the ground, to win over local communities, because they understand that if everybody donated $20 or $30, they would wash out corporate money. That Yang and Sanders did it without taking any money from political action committees. Why is this so important in this debate? Because they never wanted to engage with the comparative, one in which the most accessible form of political expression is taken away from you. Donations are the most accessible form of political expression, as in addition to voting, because of the fact that everything else, including lobbying, including backroom deals, including individual advertisements or endorsements, or publicly funding research that goes towards a certain party or certain side of the political aisle, these are things that you can only do with an exorbitant amount of money. But the one thing that literally almost anybody can do if they have an extra $20 to spend on a meal that day is to donate to a campaign that they necessarily do like. And even if it is meaningless and that $20 won't win them a campaign, it is still their prerogative to be able to make that decision to say, at the point in which you strip them out and you force them then to be a blank slate, to look at nothing and care about nothing, is the point in which their expression is taken away. Before I go on, sure.
Why is it legitimate for me, who has $20, to give it to a party to prolong its monopoly, whereas the person who doesn't have those $20 is suffering from the policy that party is passing?
Because you probably support that party. In the same way, like, why is it my right to vote for a party if it oppresses other people? Like, that is the way that people express their political actions, right? The importance here is that you have no comparative. On your comparative, the rich still own politics. The problem is that the middle class and those on our side of the house in which we empower to donate through donations do not get to and participate to any degree. The second thing under the principle is the fact that they never wanted to talk about the way that public funds should and have to be responsibly allocated in the status quo. In addition to everything my first speaker told you about the way that they waste money at the point in which these smaller campaigns, who necessarily don't have any chance of getting to power, squander money needlessly. In addition to that, it is the fact that the current administration is now in control of the process of picking the next administration. This in and of itself is an affront to democracy. It's why Trump was impeached for getting American military aid inside of American military aid wrapped inside of the 2020 presidential election, because there is a conflict of interest that cannot be resolved on their side of the house at the point in which the public decides what the public does with the next administration. Their stamp of approval then, in order to give fringe parties, in order to give extremists, in order to give the worst individuals the stamp of approval from the government, necessarily does mean that those on the ground who never wanted to support these people or were antithetical to these individual candidates now are coerced to spend their money and to support them tacitly through taxpayer dollars. This is the most important clash in this debate, because even if we are unequal to some extent, the fact is that it is basic to correcting the imbalance against the current government that you have the ability to spend your money in order to try and oust them. That you can show your discontent with the current administration by, for example, trying to prop up an opposition party that could replace them. This is essential in order to maintaining a free democracy in which you have other alternatives to opt out of the current administration that is looking over you. That can only happen on our side of the house when at the very least it is a show of opposition, even if it isn't an actual way out. Secondly, then, Why do we get more representative politics? And they never wanted to characterize minority parties, because if they were, they would see how in both sides of the House, there was no way that they would ever get a sizable political majority. Minority parties have three characteristics, or three types. The first are single issue minority parties, for example, the Green Party. The second are fringe or extreme minority parties, such as the National Front. And the third target a specific identity, such as the Arab League inside of Israel. The important thing to note about all of these types of parties is that it is impossible to have a society based off of these ideas. It is impossible to have a society where 50% of people view politics purely through the lens of environmentalism, or purely through the lens of nativism, or purely through the lens of their identity as a white person. And even if it was possible, that would be a terrible way to organize society, because rather than it being about ideology and generally where you fall upon the spectrum, it is more about incredibly niche, ascriptive portions of your character. This is why we said that it is probably better that we do not have a society in which small minority parties are those who are entering the mainstream, are genuinely in contention. Because the point in which we have, for example, people campaigning purely off of the basis of their skin color, like happens in many post-conflict societies, that is the point in which ethnic tension pops up when you have it, so that our politics is founded around the concept of incredibly small issues, incredibly minority, incredibly fringe concept. And I would say that even in their best case scenario, it is likely they will reach a non-representative form of government, because they conceded themselves that they will have things like coalitions, like minority governments, things that lead into complete deadlock. Look at Israel, for example, who just built a coalition, not based off of what people on the ground actually want, not based on people's preferences of tax policy or how to handle geopolitical issues, but purely off of the basis of political maneuvering to get Netanyahu out of power. That is what happens in coalitions. They're fundamentally unrepresentative because of the fact that small governments have to play the political game, instead of actually learning how to cater to people's needs. That's likely what's going to happen in their fragmented society, a world in which it is impossible to have expedient political decisions, because it is incredibly hard to even build a functioning government. The comparative then is on our side of the house, when you have things such as these ideas that we do agree to some extent are important. That, for example, radical climate change policy or socialist policies coming from people like AOC and Bernie Sanders should be represented in the mainstream to some degree. But that happens in a much better way when they merge with the Democratic Party, when they co-opt all of their resources, when they pull their platform slightly to the left in a way that is much safer and actually much more likely to penetrate politics than it is on their side of the house. What they get then is the complete converse, one in which populists who are unlikely to get private funding gets that money on their side of the house and necessarily are allowed to spew their terrible ideas independently without being controlled by the big parties that kept them moderate on our side of the house. Because lowering everybody isn't making everybody equal. Very proud to stand on opposition.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech, and we've now come to the conclusion of the substantive part of this debate. I now want to welcome the opposition reply speech. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you see and hear me like this?
Yes.
There currently exist laws against tax havens, but the fact that the Cayman Islands is known for its ability to be tax havens for the billionaires shows you one thing, that the rich's greed and desire to influence politics was never bound by the law. So when they say they're going to get rid of private funding and exchange and the voices of the rich that dominates politics, that makes no sense, because these leviathans will still speak. They'll just speak more quietly, more subtly, and in a way that cannot be traced. On our side, when they want to talk about things like illegal lobbying and like pivoting to their extension as the winning point of this debate, this doesn't make sense, because our first speaker from the model already set up that the FEC will still have guidelines against illegal lobbying or unfair abuse of positions of power and wealth to gain a certain influence. You can't donate. There's a cap on how much you can donate every single year, but we're not silencing anyone's political expression because of the fact that it is a little bit unequal in the status quo. With that being said, there are 3 questions I want to answer. Firstly, on that of representation, here's where proposition tries to take this debate by presenting to you an intuitive problem and solution. That money talks, and they want to level the playing field, which is money, and therefore address the problem that an incumbent party or bigger parties have more power. But they haven't responded to all the other factors in politics that renders their solution ineffective at best. The fact that connections are more entrenched for big parties, like how Giuliani is loyal to the Republicans, like how they know all these media outlets and things like that, that they automatically get more attention in media because they have fame and an established reputation. This means that you cannot remove the fact that they're just more influential or more powerful when they have all the other things like legal forces and teams of people who will also influence people and their perception of the party. But what they do is they make it worse, because rich people will still try to lobby. They'll try to sign closed doors deals, like how you'll get the exclusive right to publish anything on Washington Post with this party. But the problem is that's not something you can call out on a debate for. You cannot even engage this because it's something that's done in an non-transparent manner versus private funding that's supposed to be released every single year to all the voters and can be discussed. So they still have the same imbalance. It's just in a less transparent manner. Moreover, we talked to you about minority parties. These are parties that haven't proven themselves when we walk through every single scenario with you. Either they're a single party, a single issue party, or they just don't do a good enough job galvanizing voters and running successful campaigns with charismatic politicians who can win the general election. These are parties who deserve to be on the ballot, yes, deserve to be represented and an option to people, yes, but they don't deserve the same amount of recognition as a big successful party when they are usually single issue parties who have not proven their foothold in the general politics. That is why they don't prove to you why minority parties deserve this degree of representation yet at all. But moving on to where we win this debate on the principle when they don't really engage what we're actually saying. When we talk to you about how any money coming from the US Treasury or the British Crown is something that legitimizes parties even when they're populist and even when they're illegitimate. It is a stamp of approval on the populist and xenophobic waves of the Italian five-star movement that we think is unjustified totally, like from the get-go and the bottom line, because of all the horrible things they have done against minorities. But the worst thing is they force people into making these expressions where they legitimize these fringe parties as well, because they're forcibly acquiring tax money, using their monopoly over law, and forcing people to admit that they're a viable party, that I have to use the money that I have earned with my sweat and tears into endorsing and empowering this party, which can act against me any single day. This forced political expression, just based on the fact that I have political power, is illegitimate, and you cannot remove this right to political expression and give it to the government instead of the people. So on these principal grounds, we already win. But moreover, we told you why we have better politics, because this debate is also about two bigger parties or multiple smaller parties. They say big parties are inadequate because they have no incentive to improve, that they have a monopoly of power. But there's usually two big parties like Labor and Conservative. And even if there's just one party, there's infighting for power. When Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden both want a presidency, one will push the other one to the left more because they're engaging in this discussion and competition as well. What they do not respond to, besides the incentive structures we give you about how big parties will still improve, is the fact that on their side, they have more minority presence, because even if they have coalitions, it's easily falling apart every single year or switching every single year. I have to think about, am I wasting my vote for the Liberals when I vote for a specific coalition? And that's when the splintering of votes can easily empower someone from the other side, even though they don't deserve it. And two, if they want coalition, isn't that what a big party is? It's a united front from different groups of demographics of people saying we'll lend our rights and political sovereignty to each other and speak for each other. If they want to stand for coalition at the end of the day, that's exactly what a bigger two-party system is. The way to political representation is not to silence everyone we're so proud to oppose.
I think that speaker for that fine speech, and in order to invite the last speaker, the proposition reply speech. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right then. 90% of the US Senate is millionaires with billionaire friends. So I don't care about some fringe examples of AOC and Bernie, because the only reason why we know about them is because they were so underdogs that they actually became famous. We don't know about the other 600 people that are currently in the US Senate that are just the way I described. Millionaires with billionaire friends. This is what we're talking about in this debate. That's why they can't win on two examples. So this debate became very confusing because opposition brought a lot of points that they didn't have all the way through. So I'm going to make this very easy for you. I'm firstly going to deal with some fringe attacks from opposition, like the point about bad parties getting legitimized, because we explained from the very get-go how money is one thing. We even asked them in a POI, okay, but everyone receives the same amount of money. But what is important is for these parties not to get to power. That's what we actually actually care about. Something we brought from the second speech, but they didn't actually interact with it at any point during the debate. They just repeated again the fact that they don't want bad parties to get to power. The way that you avoid extremist parties is by making people feel enfranchised again, because otherwise in the current system, that's where they're pivoting towards extremist parties. Other fringe points from opposition: the coercion and the irrelevant parties, things that were brought from the first op, but then were kind of dropped after the first layer of rebuttal. So what is left of team opposition case is essentially this point of fragmentation and splintering about how these parties are going to not be big enough. And then reply speaker does something very funny by telling us that coalition of parties are essentially one big party. So they basically admit that one big party has, as my third speaker explained, no identity, and is just one party that creates a battle of advertising against one other big party that is not representative for anyone because they don't have any identity to represent. That is the moment that the only point that still stood for team opposition was lost. So what remains in this debate? First of all, empowering democracy through representativity. This is what we should care most about. And we were very, very explicit with this. Big money wins you elections. That was explained through multiple mechanisms on two speakers, and then there was no substantive response from team opposition. They never even tried to explain why big money is not going to win new elections. So then the only thing that stands as a rebuttal to our entire point is that you have a freedom of expression, and that freedom of expression isn't equal for everyone. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be. We believe that the freedom of expression should be as equal as possible. We shouldn't have massive discrepancies. We even explained how freedom of expression is a lot more equal than in the moment where you don't have money into it, because 200,000 followers, 2 million followers, doesn't ever compare to billions of dollars that can buy you those 200 followers in the blink of an eye and still have a lot of money to spare. That's why when we bring down the most unbalancing factor, which is money, the most important thing prevails. Democracy for the poor people that can't have $20 to spare, that's what should be more important in this debate, not the freedom of expression of the upper classes who might want to donate for their parties. That's why we win through representativity. But also we explain how you improve campaigns altogether, because now that you can't differentiate yourself through money, you need to find other allies through which you can differentiate yourself. What does this mean? It means bringing substance for the voters. That means engaging more people into the political spectrum, and also creating representation for those people, ensuring that they actually feel represented, something that went largely unrebutted throughout the debate. The last point is regarding avoiding external interferences. We explained how there is an intrinsic trade-off between having money and having votes, and how right now politicians can take the trade-off because they think they can buy the votes on the long run, and this fundamentally changes. The only thing that they told us here is that rich people do backdoor deals, and somehow they are not afraid of prison on our side of the house, but on their side they say something really funny, that they will bring regulations and everything is going to be okay. This is why we propose.
We think that speakers but fine speech, and at this point we've come to the conclusion of the we don't thank all the speakers for their contributions. As I will be adjudicating alone, I'll just unmute myself. I'd urge all the speakers to please not leave the room